Hello, class. I wanted to talk about the Gospels for this week and the coming weeks to give you just a brief introduction to the kinds of methods of critical thinking that we're going to be engaging in with regard to the four books that comprise the story of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When we talk about the word gospel in the New Testament, we're talking about the Greek word euangelion. You see it, it's right here, this word, euangelion. It means, literally, if you break it into pieces, eu in Greek means good, and angelion, that word looks like the word angel, doesn't it? Angelion is message. An angel was a messenger. So euangelion means good news, literally. And that's the word that is then translated into the gospel. Here's the thing. The gospel was its own unique genre. There are similar genres. Y'all know what a genre is, right? It's a class of literature, a kind of literature. There were similar genres. There were biographies, there were novels, there are these things called erotologies, which are ways of praising the emperors, which they would write on the sides of temples, talking about all the great deeds that the king or an emperor had done. So there were similar ways of talking about important figures in the ancient world. But the gospel has a unique genre. And it's basically the story of Jesus' death and resurrection with about a year of ministry before that. So the focus really is on the passion and the last week of Jesus' life, leading up to the crucifixion, the resurrection accounts. And then before that, like in Mark, that's probably 2 or 3 chapters. The other 10 chapters leading up to that, 10 or 11 chapters leading up to that, 12 chapters leading up to that, are just Jesus' life for a year of ministry leading up to his death and resurrection. So it's the last year of Jesus' life and his ministry. Let me skip this. Part of what we're going to be doing as we engage in critical thinking is to use the historical critical approach to the Gospels. There's a few things that historical critical approach does. First, we learn all about the background, the world of those who lived in the first century. We can test whether certain things are factually accurate or not as recorded in the Gospels based upon a correlational approach. So we can look to see whether what the Gospel tells us squares with what we know from elsewhere in the ancient world, either through archaeological evidence or through other textual evidence or through coins or inscriptions, these kinds of things, whatever we might be able to find. And then secondly, thirdly, I guess, we can figure out who was writing this and why, the conditions for writing. Who were they writing to? And why? What were they up to? What the historical critical approach cannot do is verify the Gospel's theological claims about Jesus. You can't use history to make a claim as to whether Jesus was divine or not. That's a theological claim. It's a faith claim. And so part of the skill, and some of you began doing this in the first week of the class, in your conversations with one another and discussions. I believe this. Now, this is asking me to ask all these historical critical questions. I've never asked questions like this, but my faith says this, right? You've got your mind, right, your rational approach, and you've got the faith. Well, I don't think that the historical critical approach really can verify or disclaim whether Christ was divine. That's a faith statement, right? So it's two different methods, two different ways of approaching truth. Okay? We're going to be just focusing on the historical critical approach. Now, here's the thing about the Gospels. Jesus died sometime, we think around, 30 AD? So 30 in the Common Era, CE? Maybe between 30 and 35. The first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was probably not written until around 70. Yes, I just said that. So, between 30 and 70. 30 and 70. You can see my hand. That's 40 years. 40 years of what scholars call the charismatic period. That's the fancy word for proclamation. It's the oral period in which the life of Jesus and the gospel message was transmitted from one person to another person by word of mouth. During that oral period, the gospel message also changed cultures, right? It came from a Jewish culture in what is contemporary Israel or Palestine, a Hebrew-speaking or Aramaic-speaking culture, but was translated very rapidly into Greek and spread throughout the Mediterranean, and then transmitted for 40 years. Some of you talked about in your post or in your conversations with one another, talked about the telephone game. Think of this as a huge telephone game spread out over the entire Mediterranean over a period of 40 years. Now, you can imagine, and this is before anything gets written, right? So last week we talked about how the documents actually got written. That's much later, right? The documents have to get written first and then copied before they make it to us. But before that, the stories about Jesus and his life had to be transmitted orally. The method at getting at that is called form criticism. We're not going to do too much with form criticism in this class, but what it does, it tries to detect what the earliest oral accounts were so you can get back to what might have actually happened. So it compares accounts that are very similar, because when people tell stories, they tell them in similar forms. And it tries to figure out the Sitzumleben, the life setting, the place where, the Sitzumleben is a German, fancy German word for life setting, the place where those stories were told. Right? So you compare all of these passages. So you've got a healing passage. You may have 4 or 5 different healing passages in the Gospels. As you compare all of those, you see what the elements are that are the same and what elements are different, and then you say, oh, okay, something must have happened with the blind man who got healed by Jesus, right? And we can imagine that Sitzumleben, where it was told, that story where it might have been told in the proclamation period, may have been when you're trying to illuminate some truth to someone who just doesn't get it. That's all form criticism does. It tries to get you back to the earliest oral account. We're not going to be dealing with form criticism too much in this class. However, one of the things that we're going to spend some time with, considerable time with, is the synoptic problem. Synoptic in Greek means soon, means the same. Optic, you know what optic means, those of you with glasses, means the same view, the same perspective. Synoptic problem. When you're trying to solve the synoptic problem, what you're looking at are three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that have basically the same eye view of Jesus. They basically tell the same story of Jesus, slightly nuanced. And what we're trying to get at is, okay, so if Matthew, Mark, and Luke were telling the same story, and if that doesn't go back to the oral period, it must be based upon written sources. And so we'll talk about this, and I'll just go through the evidence here very quickly of the triple tradition and the double tradition. Because there's material that Matthew, Mark, and Luke had, and there's material that Matthew and Luke have that Mark do not have. And it all seems to be that they're copying off the same written source. So we're getting into after the Gospels were written, so around 70, when Mark was written. We think Matthew and Luke maybe were writing later. So who was using whom? Because we have a lot of passages that are very similar. Let's just look at the facts. Straight up, Matthew and Luke are much longer than Mark. So if you were thinking about people who are writing, do we tend to expand in our writing or contract? I think when we write more, we tend to expand, right? So there's only a really, really very good writer when he writes and edits, reduces the size of their papers. Most people usually are adding, right? So Mark, could have been earlier. Matthew and Luke seem to have more material than Mark. So maybe they're later. That's, one possibility by just looking at their sizes. Evidence of the triple tradition. If you look at Matthew and Mark and Luke and Mark, so you put Matthew and Mark side by side and Luke and Mark side by side. So put the two side by side. Matthew seems to have about 80% of Mark's verses in word for word, more or less word for word agreement. Luke has about 65% of Mark's verses in word for word. So in 118 pericopes, it's a fancy word for passages, Matthew has 118 of Mark's pericopes, and Luke has about 96 of Mark's pericopes. So they change, or they add, they take from Mark. If you were looking at, it's like they use Mark as a source and they're cutting and pasting. It's really, you'll see this in a little exercise that we're going to do for class. Let's skip the minor agreements. That's just a little bit spooky. The weird thing is Matthew and Luke, when they're using Mark, change Mark in exactly the same way. That's bizarre. Okay, we don't know why. We'll get back to that. Maybe. The double tradition. There are about 4,000 words in connected passages which Mark does not have that Matthew and Luke have. A lot of it is verbatim, word for word. And it's all didactic. It's all teaching material. So Matthew and Luke have all of this stuff about Jesus' teaching, all of Jesus' teachings, the many, like the Lord's Prayer in the double tradition, the Beatitudes are in the double tradition, all of this stuff that Matthew and Luke have that Mark does not have, and it's verbatim. So where does that come from? So that's all the statistical facts. If you look at all of that, you need a method to figure out, okay, how do we get at what might be written and who's using whom? And source criticism is the method that we're using, the critical method, the critical thinking method. It looks for a written source that either Matthew, Mark, or Luke, or both, or maybe using, and it really goes through and does very, very careful analysis, line by line, word for word analysis. And then it tries to reconstruct what happened, who used whom, and how that works. Okay? Let me just introduce to you a couple of ideas. First off, the double tradition, the stuff that Matthew and Luke have, most scholars believe that there is a source that Matthew and Luke had, a collection of Jesus' sayings, probably a written source that was collected during that oral period and written down that Matthew and Luke copied into their document. Okay? And so, overall, this is the diagram. I know this sounds really confusing. But Matthew and Luke were later than Mark and later than Q, this explains how Matthew and Luke both seem to have so much of Mark. Remember, I said Matthew has 80% of Mark, Luke 65% of Mark, and then Matthew and Luke have this double tradition that Mark doesn't have. We think that comes from Q. All that teaching material comes from Q. This is what is called the two-source hypothesis. It is a hypothesis that helps us to sort of reconcile or understand how the Gospels were written and what sources were being used as they wrote their Gospels. So Mark probably had oral sources that he was using, and Luke tells us that he was using written sources as well as oral sources. So Luke said he had a couple Gospels or a couple texts in front of him. His servants of the word is what he calls them. So people that he's using that have written something, he's got written accounts and probably people he's interviewed. And Matthew, too, has people that he's using and probably has a copy of Mark in front of him. There's nothing wrong with this. Now, if you do it for your papers, you're in trouble. Right? Don't do it. Don't copy from one another. But there were different norms at that time, and everyone was trying to get it right. Everyone was trying to get Jesus' story right. Right? So they wanted to follow Mark because, maybe Mark was the first. He was a disciple of Peter, and they wanted to get it as best from the source as they could, and then Matthew and Luke seemed to then use Mark and probably this other source. There's a much larger. Your textbook actually talks about the four-source hypothesis. This can be expanded. So if you look at the four-source hypothesis, the only thing that means is that Matthew has a written source and Luke has a written source that only they have access to. Don't worry about all this. This explains some of the intricacies in Matthew and Luke, where it seems like Matthew and Luke are changing Mark and changing Q in exactly the same way or in different ways. That gets to be really chaotic here. You can keep drawing lines like this if you're a scholar. I've seen so many presentations on this stuff at conferences, and it seems like these slides get bigger and bigger. Don't worry about it. There's one way that is really actually a very simple way of putting this together. It's coming back now. It's not accepted by a lot of scholars, but it's coming back. William Farmer is a more recent person who's pushed this, but the Griesbach theory states that Matthew was written first, Luke uses Matthew, and Mark had a copy of Matthew and Luke in front of him. It's very simple. It's a very elegant theory. The only problem with the Griesbach hypothesis is that Mark's Greek is really very, very rustic. It's not very good Greek. It's very Aramaicized Greek. It's really kind of a mess. And Luke's Greek is excellent, and so is Matthew. So, if Mark were copying from Matthew and Luke, why would he mess up the Greek? I don't know. And how would he make it shorter? Why would he cut a bunch of stuff out? I don't know. I don't like that. Because Mark is a great storyteller. He's just not great with the Greek. I just can't imagine that he would just cut all this great stuff from Matthew and Luke. So I don't buy the Griesbach hypothesis, but some people do. So all of this is source criticism. So I've introduced you to form criticism and source criticism today. One other thing that I wanted to introduce to you here in this lecture very briefly is the idea of redaction criticism. Redaction criticism is going the other way. So given that you've got source criticism and that you found, say Matthew and Luke are using Mark and Q, when they change it, if they change it for a reason, why do they change it? That's what redaction criticism gets at. It takes the results of source criticism and says, okay, so we've got this source that Matthew and Luke were using, but Matthew changes it this way and Luke has it this way. Why? And if you can see that they did it the same way over and over and over again with a theological purpose, maybe they're putting their own spin on the source. So that's what redaction criticism does. Lots of stuff. I've got a whole bunch more slides. I'm not going to show them to you. I hope this was helpful just to get you into the critical thinking methods that we use when we approach the gospel. These are methods we're going to be using over the next couple of weeks as we talk about the gospels. So source criticism is going to be, high on your radar. We're also going to be engaging in historical critical work. Maybe a little bit you'll hear me talking about the theology of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Well, that's redaction criticism. So I'll be engaging in a number of these throughout the next few weeks. And again, this is another way of looking at the Bible. I hope it's not too shocking for you, but this is the critical scholarly way which scholars use to investigate the scriptures. And I hope it expands your mind some and opens things up for you. All right, thank you. And I hope this lecture was useful to you.